Somewhere in the middle of the Bible, tucked between a genealogy and a flood story, there are 4 sentences. Just 4. They describe beings called the Nephilim, the sons of God taking human wives, giants in the land, and mighty men of old. And then the narrative moves on, almost as if nothing unusual just happened. No explanation, no elaboration. The text drops this extraordinary image into the reader's lap and keeps walking. What's remarkable isn't just what those sentences say, it's what they didn't say. Because what followed from those 4 lines across thousands of years of interpretation, commentary, mythology, and debate is one of the strangest and most layered traditions in the entire history of religious thought. Entire books were written to explain them. Ancient scholars argued about them. Communities built cosmologies around them. And today they show up in documentaries, best-selling novels, late-night forum threads, and more YouTube videos than you could count in a week. So tonight, we're going to walk through all of that carefully. Not chasing headlines, not looking for shock, just sitting with a genuinely old and genuinely strange puzzle and trying to understand how it got so large from such a small beginning. If you're listening to this while you're winding down, or lying in the dark letting the night settle around you, good. That's actually a reasonable way to approach something like this. Ancient mysteries don't usually reward urgency. They reward patience. They reward the kind of attention you give to something when you're not in a hurry, when you're willing to sit with uncertainty and let a complicated picture come together slowly. And before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you right now, and what time is it for you? I genuinely check the comments on these videos, and it never gets less interesting. Someone in Edinburgh at 2 a.m, someone in Melbourne eating breakfast, someone in Sao Paulo who can't sleep and ended up here somehow. Tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is. That geography of listeners, all those different people in different darkness and different light, it always feels like the right company for a question this old. Now here's what we're actually going to cover, because this topic has a lot of layers and it's worth knowing where we're headed before we start. We'll begin with the biblical texts themselves, Genesis 6, Numbers 13, Deuteronomy, and a handful of other passages that mention unusual peoples with unusual names. We'll read those texts carefully, paying attention to the original language and what gets lost or changed in translation, because some of the most important parts of this story live entirely in the gap between one word and another. From there, we'll move into the Second Temple period, roughly 500 BCE to 100 CE, when Jewish writers were actively debating and expanding on the Genesis account. This is where a book called 1 Enoch enters the story, along with the Watchers, an entire mythology about fallen divine beings and their earthly offspring. It's a rich, strange, and very old tradition that most people have never encountered, and it changes the way the Genesis text looks considerably. Then we'll look eastward into ancient Mesopotamia, where similar ideas about gods and humans mixing, about semi-divine heroes and wise beings from before the flood, turn up in texts that predate Genesis by centuries. The overlap there is not coincidental, and it tells us something important about how ancient people understood the boundary between the divine and the human. After that, we'll come forward in time and look at how these traditions move through later folklore, how giant-slaying stories and tales of ancient superhuman peoples spread across cultures, and what that spreading might tell us about why these ideas were so persistent and so useful to the people who told them. And finally, we'll look at what archaeology actually says about human height in the ancient world, about the megaliths and ruins that some people today interpret as evidence of beings beyond ordinary human capability, about where the physical record confirms ancient memory and where it simply goes quiet. Throughout all of that, I want to be honest about something up front. This is a topic with a very wide gap between what sources suggest and what they can actually prove. Ancient texts are layered things. They carry history and memory and theology and politics and storytelling all braided together, and pulling one thread usually disturbs all the others. Translation makes it harder. The distance of time makes it harder still. What we can do is look carefully, notice what the texts actually say, what they don't say, where scholars agree, where they disagree sharply, and where the honest answer is still genuinely open. That kind of care isn't a limitation. It's actually what makes the mystery worth sitting with. Because here's the thing about those 4 lines in Genesis. They're strange in a way that feels deliberate, like a door left slightly open. And what's on the other side isn't a simple answer. It's a long corridor of questions that people have been walking down for a very, very long time. Let's start walking. Before we read a single word of Genesis, it's worth asking a question that doesn't get asked often enough. What kind of thing are we actually reading? That might sound obvious. It's the Bible, it's Scripture. But those answers, true as they are for many people, don't quite settle the literary question. Because Genesis, like the rest of the ancient Near Eastern literature that surrounds it and in many ways shaped it, is not one kind of writing. It's several kinds braided together. And the people who first heard it, who first copied it and argued about it and passed it down, would have understood that in ways that most modern readers simply don't. Not because modern readers are less intelligent, but because the conventions of ancient literature are genuinely different from anything we learn in school. Scholars use a handful of terms for the different kinds of writing that show up in texts like Genesis: myth, genealogy, etiological story, cultural memory. These aren't insults to the text. They're descriptive categories that help us understand what a piece of writing was doing for the people who created it and preserved it. A myth, in the academic sense, is not a synonym for falsehood. It's a story that carries meaning larger than its surface narrative. It explains origins. It encodes values. It describes the relationship between the human and the divine in ways that a simple historical account never could. When ancient peoples told stories about gods and primordial beings and the earliest days of the world, they weren't necessarily making claims we would recognize as factual. They were doing something closer to what poetry does, reaching for truths that plain language can't hold. Genealogy in the ancient world served a different purpose than it does today. We think of genealogy as a record of descent, a family tree. But in the ancient Near East, genealogies were also political documents. They established legitimacy. They connected living communities to honoured ancestors. They could be edited, extended, compressed, or reshaped depending on what the community needed to assert about itself at a given moment. When a genealogy includes a figure we can't locate in any other historical record, that doesn't necessarily mean the figure never existed. It also doesn't necessarily mean they did. It means we should ask what work that name was doing in the list. Etiological stories are perhaps the most straightforward category. These are stories that explain how something came to be, why a place has a particular name, why a people practices a particular custom, why certain groups are considered enemies and others are considered kin. Ancient literature is full of these, and once you learn to recognize them, you start seeing them everywhere in Genesis. Cultural memory is the broadest category and in some ways the most important. It's the way communities preserve knowledge about the past through stories, rituals, and oral tradition, long before anyone writes anything down. Cultural memory is remarkably durable. It can carry real historical information across hundreds or even thousands of years. But it also transforms as it travels. Details shift, figures merge, stories that originally described one thing get attached to another. By the time cultural memory becomes written text, what you have is a layered object, part history, part interpretation, part theology, part the accumulated editorial decisions of every scribe who touched it along the way. Which brings us to scribal culture, In the ancient world, texts weren't printed. They were copied by hand, usually by trained scribes who worked in religious or royal institutions. These scribes weren't passive copiers, they were interpreters. When they encountered a word they didn't recognize, they might substitute one they did. When a passage seemed incomplete or confusing, they might add a gloss, a clarifying note that in the next generation of copying could quietly migrate into the body of the text itself. When two different versions of the same story existed in different communities, a scribe trying to produce a unified document might weave them together, resulting in a text with what scholars call doublets, places where the same event seems to happen twice, with slightly different details. This is not speculation. It's one of the most established findings of biblical scholarship, the result of 2 centuries of careful comparison of manuscripts, translations, and parallel texts from neighbouring cultures. The Hebrew Bible as we have it today is the product of this long process, and Genesis in particular shows clear signs of being assembled from multiple earlier sources, each with its own vocabulary, its own theological emphases, its own version of certain key events. Oral tradition adds another layer. Most of what eventually became Genesis existed as spoken narrative long before it was written down. Oral traditions are not simply imperfect precursors to written texts. They're a different kind of system entirely, one with its own mechanisms for preserving accuracy and its own mechanisms for variation. A skilled oral performer can maintain the core of a story across centuries with remarkable fidelity. But oral traditions also respond to their audience, to the moment, to the questions the community is asking right now. What gets written down is, in a sense, a snapshot of one version of a living tradition. This is why translation matters so much, and why it can go so quietly wrong. When you translate an ancient text, you're not just converting words. You're making interpretive choices that can steer the entire meaning of a passage in one direction or another. A single Hebrew word might have a range of meanings, and the translator has to choose one. That choice then gets crystallized in the translation, inherited by every reader who encounters it, and assumed to be obvious when in fact it was always contested. The word Nephilim is a perfect example of exactly this problem, and we'll spend real time on it in a moment. But the broader principle matters here. Whenever a translation sounds unambiguous, it's worth asking what the original word actually carried, what other meanings scholars have proposed, and what is lost when you flatten a range of meaning into a single English word. The most important parts of this tradition often live in those gaps. So what does all of this mean for how we should approach a passage like Genesis 6? It means we should read it as what it is. Ancient literature shaped by time, tradition, and multiple hands. Not with suspicion, but with attention. Not trying to find the single correct meaning underneath, but trying to understand the range of meanings the text has carried and why those meanings mattered to the communities that preserved it. There's a method in that. Prioritize the earliest attestations, the oldest versions of a text or tradition, and treat later elaborations as elaborations, interesting and important in their own right, but not necessarily more accurate. Compare variants. When different ancient sources tell different versions of the same story, the differences are often more informative than the similarities. Avoid overconfidence. The honest answer to many questions about these texts is that scholars have strong hypotheses and genuine disagreements, and the evidence doesn't always resolve them cleanly. That method matters especially for what we're tracing here, because the Nephilim are not a single, simple claim. They're a tradition with multiple streams. There is what Genesis says, which is brief and somewhat ambiguous. There is what Numbers and Deuteronomy say, which adds different details and raises new questions. There is what the writers of the Second Temple period made of it all, which is elaborate and varied and doesn't entirely agree with itself. There is what Mesopotamian texts suggest, which puts the whole conversation in a different frame. and there is what later folklore carried forward, which changed and grew in ways that have almost nothing left of the original 4 lines. None of those streams is simply the real tradition, and the others distortions of it. They are all part of a long conversation that ancient and not so ancient people were having about a question that genuinely preoccupied them. Were there beings in the deep past that weren't quite human and weren't quite divine? What happened to them? What does their existence mean for the boundary between the mortal world and whatever lies beyond it? That's a serious question. People who are serious thinkers took it seriously, and the fact that it doesn't have a clean answer isn't a failure of the tradition. It's actually the reason the tradition kept growing, kept generating new interpretations, kept pulling new readers into its orbit across thousands of years. Reading these texts like ancient people means setting aside the expectation that a text should resolve into one clear meaning, one definitive fact, one settled conclusion. Ancient literature wasn't built for that. It was built to be inhabited, argued over, returned to, read in community and read alone in the dark. It was built to hold questions open long enough for the questions themselves to teach you something. That's the posture we'll carry forward. Curious, careful, honest about what we don't know, and genuinely interested in what these layers reveal when you look at them slowly. So now, with all of that in place, let's go to the text itself. 4 sentences, possibly the strangest 4 sentences in the entire Hebrew Bible. When human beings began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them. The passage begins like that, simple, almost gentle, no monsters yet, no angels, just humanity doing what humanity does in Genesis, filling the earth. Sons of God saw that the daughters of men were good, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Already, if you slow down, the ground shifts. 2 groups. Sons of God. Daughters of men. One looks, one is looked at. One chooses, one is chosen. The Hebrew uses the ordinary verb for see and the very broad adjective good, the same word used in Genesis 1 when God sees that creation is good. There's nothing in the wording itself about beauty, seduction, or violence. Those are later inferences. The text simply says they were good, and the sons of God took them as wives. Then comes a sudden interruption, as if another voice cuts in. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. This line doesn't explain what just happened. It reacts to it. Something about this union, or about human multiplication in general, triggers a divine limit. The emphasis is on human frailty, for he is flesh. The number, 120 years, has been read as a cap on individual human lifespans or as a countdown to the flood, or both. The text doesn't clarify, it just drops the decree and moves on. And then, abruptly, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of name. 4 verses, that's it. No backstory, no description of what the Nephilim looked like, no heights, no weapons, no ages, just they were there, also afterward. And they are somehow connected to this crossing of boundaries between sons of God and daughters of men. Every major question that later readers will obsess over is left open. Who are the sons of God? In Hebrew, Bene Elohim. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, that phrase usually points to divine or semi-divine beings, members of a heavenly council. In Job, the sons of God present themselves before the Lord. In some ancient Near Eastern texts, similar phrases refer to younger gods, attendants, or high-ranking spirits. That's one interpretive tradition. Genesis 6 is describing a breach in the cosmic order, where heavenly beings take human women as wives and beget hybrid offspring. But not everyone in antiquity was comfortable with that reading, and not all modern scholars are either. Another approach sees sons of God as a way of talking about powerful human rulers, kings and nobles who claim divine sanction. Ancient monarchs often styled themselves sons of a god. In that reading, Genesis 6 criticizes predatory royal behavior, elites taking whomever they chose, violating ordinary social boundaries, and producing a class of mighty men whose fame may be tinged with violence and oppression. A third line of interpretation, which shows up in later Jewish and Christian thought, suggests that sons of God refers to one particular human lineage, the line of Seth, the son given to Adam and Eve after Abel, while daughters of men represent the line of Cain or humanity at large. On that view, Genesis 6 laments intermarriage between a pious group and an impious one, the breakdown of a fragile boundary that had preserved righteousness in the world. All three readings are trying to solve the same problem. The text is sparse. It doesn't tell us what category the sons of God belong to. It just assumes the phrase will ring a bell for its earliest hearers. Then we have the word Nephilim. It appears only here and in one other passage in the Hebrew Bible. It's not translated, it's transliterated, carried straight into most languages as a name. The root is debated. It might be connected to a verb meaning to fall, which gives rise to the idea of fallen ones. Some have taken that to mean fallen angels. Others suggest it might mean those who cause others to fall. Warriors, killers, people who bring others down on the battlefield. The text doesn't comment. It doesn't say the Nephilim are the direct offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, only that they were on the earth, in those days, and also afterward, when these unions took place. The grammar lets you connect them tightly. It also lets you keep them slightly apart, as overlapping phenomena rather than simple cause and effect. What it does say is that these were the Sibbarim, the mighty ones, who were of old men of name. That phrase, men of name, is hero language. In the ancient world, to have a name was to have renown, reputation, a story that would be told after you were gone. Kings, champions, founding ancestors, these are the figures who become men of name. So Genesis 6 gestures toward an older world of legendary heroes, people whose deeds were memorable enough to echo into the present. But it reframes them very quietly. The mighty men of old are not simply celebrated. They appear as part of the build-up to judgment. Whatever glory they had, it lives on in memory, but in this narrative their age is the age that leads to the flood, and that placement matters. The Nephilim verses sit like a brief dense knot right before the flood story truly begins. Human wickedness fills the earth. Violence spreads. God is grieved. A decision is made to unmake what has been made. And wrapped into that moment, almost in passing, is this image of boundary-crossing unions and famous figures of old. The text never says explicitly that the Nephilim caused the flood. It never states that the Sons of God episode is the reason for the 120-year decree. It simply lays them side by side. Human multiplication, divine human interaction, the rise of famous mighty men, a divine limitation on human life, and then, in the very next lines, the announcement that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. Equally important is what we don't get. No names for the sons of God, no individual Nephilim listed, no motives given for why the sons of God acted as they did, or why the daughters consented or didn't. No explicit moral commentary on the unions themselves. The narrative doesn't pause to explain, it just moves on to Noah. That brevity is not an accident, it creates a kind of vacuum. Later writers will feel the pull of that empty space and rush to fill it, with names for the watchers, with stories of forbidden knowledge, with elaborate portraits of giants who stride across the primeval earth. But at this point in Genesis, all we have is 4 lines. A hint of something older, a shadow of heroic ages, a disturbing blurring of the line between heaven and earth, and then the sound of approaching water rising in the background. If we stay inside the Hebrew for a moment, the mystery feels contained, strange but compact. A handful of rare words, a brief sketch, then the flood. But the Bible doesn't live only in Hebrew. For most of Jewish and Christian history, people met this passage in translation, and each translation is already an interpretation, already a set of choices about what these words are allowed to mean. Take Nephilim. As we said, it's almost unknown. It shows up here and again in Numbers, and that's it. That kind of rarity is a nightmare for anyone who wants clear definitions. Dictionaries like lots of examples, lots of context, patterns you can see. With Nephilim, we get two scenes, centuries apart, and both are freighted with fear. So where do you go? You reach for roots. Many scholars connect Nephilim to a Hebrew verb that means to fall. That gives you fallen ones, which sounds evocative, almost explanatory. But even if the root connection is right, and not everyone agrees, that still doesn't tell you what kind of fall we're talking about. Fallen from heaven, fallen in battle, those who make others fall. Ancient Hebrew, like most languages, lets one root produce a whole cluster of meanings. You can't just point to the root and say, there, that settles it. It doesn't. It just opens possibilities. And even the root itself is debated. Some have proposed that Nephilim might be a borrowed word, pulled in from a neighbouring language, perhaps connected to a regional term for heroes, or dead ancestors, or warrior champions. If that's true, then hunting through Hebrew grammar for its real meaning might be chasing the wrong trail entirely. This is one of the basic problems with rare words. The fewer times a term appears, the more our explanations lean on guesswork, analogy, and etymology. Etymology feels scientific, with roots and cognates and neat little family trees. But meaning doesn't always stay obedient to its family history. Words wander, they drift, they pick up new senses in new settings. A word that once meant one thing in a ritual context can mean something else entirely in a legend. Ancient translators knew this problem firsthand. When Jewish scholars in the centuries before Christ translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the version we call the Septuagint, they had to decide what to do with Nephilim. They didn't leave it as Nephilim, they rendered it as Gigantes. That single decision changed the history of this passage. In Greek, Gigantes is already a loaded word. It evokes the mythic giants, rebellious figures who battle the Olympian gods in Greek stories, or massive earthborn beings who tower over ordinary humans. The Greek term itself is not just tall people. It carries associations of cosmic conflict, primordial ages, and beings that blur the line between god, monster, and human. By choosing Gigantes, the translators didn't just pick a neutral equivalent, they steered the imagination of Greek-speaking readers. Now when the text said, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days," a Greek audience heard, "The giants were on the earth in those days." The echo of their own mythic tradition vibrated in the background. Was that a misunderstanding? Maybe. Or maybe it was the best available approximation in a world where Nephilim was already obscure even to native Hebrew speakers. The translators might have thought, these are legendary mighty ones from ancient times. In our language, the closest thing is Gigantes. It's a compromise, a bridge between worlds. But once that bridge is built, later readers walk across it automatically. Early Christian writers using the Greek Bible encounter Gigantes in Genesis 6 and then see the same word or related ones in other texts. Over time, Nephilim and giants fuse in the imagination. The etymology, fallen ones or whatever else, fades into the background. The translation choice hardens into tradition. The same thing happens with sons of God. In Hebrew, Bene Elohim can, in some contexts, clearly point to heavenly beings. In other contexts, similar phrases can be used poetically for Israel or metaphorically for rulers. The phrase is not locked into one single technical sense. Its meaning shifts with the setting. In Job, the sons of God present themselves before the Lord in a heavenly council. In some psalms, language about sons of God and sons of the Most High seems to describe divine beings in God's court. Elsewhere, Israel is described as God's son, and kings are adopted as sons in royal ideology. The same words, different frames. Now watch what happens when those words translated. In the Septuagint, Genesis 6:2 becomes, "The angels of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful," not sons of God, but angels. Here again, the Greek translators make an interpretive move. They don't just render the phrase literally, they identify the category. These are not kings, not a pious human lineage. They are angeloi, messengers, heavenly beings. This choice will echo through later interpretation. Jewish texts like 1 Enoch, which expand the Genesis story into a detailed narrative about watchers, forbidden unions, and giant offspring, are living in the same conceptual world. Early Christians reading Genesis in Greek will almost automatically think angels when they see this line, but it's crucial to notice what has happened. A phrase that in Hebrew sits open and somewhat ambiguous has been narrowed by translation. Not necessarily distorted, but focused. A whole range of possible meanings has been filtered down to one dominant image, and once that image is in place, it shapes how later readers hear everything else. If the sons of God are angels, then Nephilim are much more likely to be understood as their hybrid offspring. If the sons of God are royal figures, then Nephilim might lean toward a class of warrior elites. If the sons of God are a particular lineage, then Nephilim may become a label for the compromise result of intermarriage. Every translation option nudges the whole story in a different direction. This is where our modern tools can mislead us. It's tempting to open a lexicon, find an entry that says Nephilim giants or Nephilim fallen ones, and feel finished. But lexicons are human artifacts. They summarize scholarly debates. When the data is thin, two occurrences, unclear contexts, the dictionary entry cannot resolve the ambiguity. It only records a set of educated guesses. The same is true for Gibrim, the mighty ones. It can mean warriors, heroes, men of great strength, sometimes even simply strong. And men of name can be positive, famous heroes, or ominous, figures whose notoriety lingers. There is no single automatic gloss that fits every occurrence. So what can we say, carefully? We can say that Nephilim probably evoked for ancient hearers the idea of formidable figures from a distant age, associated with might, with fear, with stories of renown. We can say that by the time the passage was widely read in Greek, that idea was deeply entwined with the concept of gigantes, giants in a mythic, not just biological sense. We can say that sons of God in Hebrew lives on a spectrum of meaning, and that the Septuagint's decision to render them as angels helped cement one particular reading that later Jewish and Christian writers would amplify. What we cannot do, at least with full confidence, is use etymology or a single translation to close the case. The words are too rare, the contexts are too compressed, the traditions too layered. Translation, in a passage like this, is less like decoding a secret message and more like opening a set of doors. Each door leads into a different room of interpretation, divine beings, tyrant kings, ancient heroes, fallen ones. The history of reading Genesis 6 is, in large part, the history of which doors different communities have chosen to walk through. And as we move forward to Numbers, to Deuteronomy, and to later retellings, we'll see how those early choices, Nephilim as gigantes, sons of God as angels, mighty ones as heroes, keep echoing, shaping the way giants are remembered long after the brief Hebrew lines that first named them have fallen silent. When we finally meet the word Nephilim again, it's not in a calm genealogy or a cosmic prologue, it's in a panic. Numbers 13 drops us into a story already full of tension. Israel has come out of Egypt, crossed the wilderness, and now stands on the threshold of the land they've been promised. This is not abstract theology. It's the question, will we actually make it? And the first step is reconnaissance. 12 men go in as scouts. They spend 40 days moving through unfamiliar hills, valleys, and fortified towns. When they come back, they're carrying both data and emotion. The report starts reasonable enough. The land is good. It flows with milk and honey. The fruit is enormous. They even bring back a cluster of grapes so large it becomes part of Israel's memory. On one level, everything God said about the land is true. Then the tone shifts. The people who live there are powerful. The cities are fortified and very large. We even saw the descendants of Enoch there. From that point, the narrative stops feeling like a neutral survey and starts feeling like a fear cascade. The more they talk, the bigger everything becomes. The Amalekites are in the south, the Hittites and Jebusites in the hill country, the Canaanites by the sea. The land is suddenly full of enemies, and the enemies are everywhere. Caleb tries to interrupt. We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But his voice is drowned out by a louder, more contagious story. We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And then comes the line that will echo all the way back to Genesis in later imaginations. The land, through which we have gone to spy it out, is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are men of great size. There we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Enoch, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and so we seemed to them. This is the so-called fear report. It's not a geology report or a census, it's panic translated into speech. Notice how the logic works. First, men of great size. That alone could mean tall warriors, imposing figures, maybe people who simply looked large to a population that had spent decades as enslaved labourers and then wanderers. But fear doesn't stop at large. It reaches for old words, legendary labels. Nephilim. In the Hebrew, the phrase is a bit tangled. There we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anakim from the Nephilim. Many scholars see this as a gloss, an explanatory aside, maybe even a later scribal clarification. Others read it as the spies themselves reaching for the biggest, scariest category they know, and saying, those Anakim we saw, they're from that line, they're that kind of being. Either way, the text does something subtle. It associates the Anakim, a group clearly rooted in the geography and politics of Canaan, with the much more shadowy primeval Nephilim from Genesis 6. The ancient pre-flood mighty ones are suddenly being invoked on the edge of Israel's historical narrative. Mythic fear is being imported into a political crisis. But what does that mean in the story itself? The line, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and so we seemed to them, is almost certainly not a careful statement about relative body proportions. It's rhetoric. It's how terror feels from the inside. This is how people talk when they're overwhelmed. Soldiers describing an enemy force as an ocean of men. Refugees saying everyone was against them. Trauma compresses and distorts perception. Details blur. Scale inflates. The language of exaggeration becomes a way of conveying impact rather than measurement. In that sense, Nephilim here functions like a verbal exclamation mark. These aren't just tall guys. They are those ones, the storied figures from the age when humans were barely human, when giants and heroes filled the world. You can almost hear the implied conclusion, we have no chance. The narrative itself quietly undercuts this report. God calls it an evil or bad report, not because the land isn't good, but because fear has twisted the truth into paralysis. The punishment that follows, 40 years of wandering, is not framed as God responding to literal giants, but to Israel's refusal to trust in the face of intimidating circumstances. This is important when we think about how Numbers 13 has been used later. If you read this scene as a straightforward ethnographic note, there were literally pre-flood hybrids walking around in Canaan, the whole weight of the story shifts. The focus moves from the people's reaction to the nature of the beings they saw. The narrative becomes an ontological claim about creatures instead of a moral and theological claim about trust, memory, and fear. But inside the flow of Numbers, the function is different. The fear report magnifies the obstacle to justify retreat. It weaponizes memory. Old names, old terrors, perhaps half-remembered stories of ancient mighty ones are pulled into the present as proof that obedience would be suicidal. Later traditions will reverse the direction. Jewish and Christian interpreters who already think of Nephilim as gigantic offspring of fallen angels hear Numbers 13 and see confirmation. If Nephilim are in Canaan, then Genesis 6 must have produced a lasting lineage. The crisis at the border of the land becomes evidence that the old hybrid race survived the flood or reappeared afterward. Numbers is read back into Genesis, and Genesis is read through Numbers. The fear report, originally a distorted perception, becomes a building block in a larger supernatural history of the world. Our text doesn't force that move, it allows it through the shared use of a rare word, but it doesn't insist on it. Read slowly. Numbers 13 offers something more grounded and, in a way, more unsettling. It shows how human beings, standing on the edge of something hard and unknown, reach instinctively for the biggest stories they have to explain why they cannot go forward. It shows how language, Nephilim, Anakim, grasshoppers, can turn a challenge into an impossibility. The giants here are as much inside the spy's imagination as they are on the hillsides of Canaan. So when this passage speaks of Nephilim and Anakim, we can distinguish layers. On one level, we have tall, formidable local populations, remembered and labelled by name. On another, we have the rhetoric of fear, drawing on legendary categories to express dread. And beyond both, we have the narrative's own purpose, not to catalogue non-human beings, but to expose how a community handles terror when promise meets reality. As we move to Deuteronomy, we'll see those same names, Anakim, rephaim, tall peoples, handled differently. There, the language of height and terror becomes part of a map, a way of organizing the land's memory. And the question returns, are we reading reports of monsters or stories about what it feels like to be small in a dangerous world? When we arrive in Deuteronomy, the mood is different. Numbers drops us into the immediacy of fear. Deuteronomy looks back. It is Moses, near the end, retelling the journey, organizing experiences into memory, turning scattered events into a story that can be handed on. And as he does this, something interesting happens to the giants. They become a list. Listen to the way Deuteronomy 2-3 walks us through the Transjordan. It reads almost like a guided tour of ancestral tallness. You're about to pass through the territory of your relatives, the descendants of Esau. They're great and numerous, and as tall as the Anakim, but the Lord destroyed the Horites before them, and they dispossessed them. Then just a little further, the Emim formerly lived there, a people great and numerous, and as tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. And again, the land of the rephaim, formerly inhabited by a people great and numerous, and as tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as rephaim, but the Ammonites call them Zamzumim. Finally, in Bashan, for only your king of Bashan was left of the remnant of the rephaim. It's as if the narrative pauses at each territorial boundary and says, here is who was here before you. Here is what people used to call them. Here is how they fit into the larger pattern. This is more than colour commentary. It's a catalogue, a way of stitching geography, ancestry, and reputation together. Notice the rhythm. Great and numerous, and as tall as the Anakim. The Anakim have become the baseline unit of height. Other groups are measured against them. The Emim, like the Anakim, the Zamzumim, like the Anakim, the rephaim, same category. What we're seeing is not a neutral anthropological survey, it's territorial memory. In a world without satellite maps, land is remembered through stories. Hills and valleys are not just coordinates, they are where this people once lived, where that king once ruled, where those battles once happened. Deuteronomy turns this into a theology of space. Here is where God cleared the way for Esau. Here is where Moab received land. Here is where you're not allowed to harass them, because their allotment is theirs. The tall peoples become markers in a sacred geography. They also become part of identity formation. Israel is being asked to see itself in a particular way. You're not the first to face intimidating inhabitants. Your relatives have done this before. The descendants of Esau dealt with the Horites. Moab displaced the Emim. Ammon displaced the Zamzumim. Nations you might not consider especially holy have seen peoples as tall as the Anakim come and go. The implication is quiet but sharp. If God has done this for others, will you really say he cannot do it for you? In that sense, the catalogue of tall peoples works in the opposite direction from the fear report in Numbers 13. The same language, great, numerous, as tall as Anakim, is no longer an argument for retreat. It's a reminder that even the most daunting populations are temporary occupants in the larger story of divine allotment. Layered onto this is the peculiar word rephaim. In Deuteronomy 2-3, rephaim functions as an umbrella term for old, formidable groups. Og is of the remnant of the rephaim. The Emim and the Zamzumim are also counted as rephaim. It looks like a category of peoples may be remembered as ancient, powerful occupants whose time has passed. But elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, rephaim has a different flavour. In poetic texts like Isaiah 14 and Psalm 88, rephaim seems to denote the shades of the dead, inhabitants of the underworld. Powerless echoes of once living persons. Ugaritic texts from Israel's wider cultural neighbourhood use a similar term, Arpum, for deified ancestors or royal dead associated with the netherworld. So we have a word that can mean, in one context, ancient mighty peoples, and in another, the dead in the underworld. These meanings are not necessarily in conflict. They can feed each other. Over time, the memory of long-gone warrior groups can blend with traditions of powerful ancestral spirits. The rephaim who once walked the land become the rephaim who now inhabit the realm of the dead. Genealogy, myth, and mortuary belief start to overlap. This is where cultural memory does its quiet work. A name that might have begun as an ethnic label hardens into a category of the long-ago great ones, and then seeps down into language for the dead themselves. When Deuteronomy calls Og a remnant of the rephaim, it's not just saying he's tall, it's locating him at the tail end of a world that is passing away, a survivor of a shadowy, heroic age. The text underlines his status with one concrete detail: his bed. His bed, an iron bed, is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, by the common cubit. Here we are offered a measurement, about 4 meters long, nearly 2 meters wide. Readers across the centuries have seized on this as proof of literal gigantic stature. But bed is not the only possible translation of the Hebrew word. It can also mean a ceremonial couch, even a sarcophagus. Iron, in the early Iron Age, is not mundane. It's prestige material. In other words, Deuteronomy points to Og's iron bed the way later storytellers might point to a giant sword hanging in a royal hall. It's a material token, a relic that anchors the legend. Whether or not anyone ever saw the object, the claim, you can go and look at it in Rabbah gives the story weight. Artifact stories like this are part of how legends root themselves in the landscape. They say, "This happened, the proof is over there." Royal propaganda loves this kind of thing. Ancient Near Eastern inscriptions are full of kings boasting that they defeated mighty ones, great kings, all the land from X to Y. The bigger the opponent, the greater the victory. To say that Israel, by God's help, has defeated Og of Bashan, last remnant of the Rephaim whose iron bed still sits in a foreign city, is to say, our story belongs in the same register as the great royal tales all around us, but with a different hero. The catalogue of tall peoples, then, does several jobs at once. It remembers past populations and their displacement. It reassures a new generation that terrifying enemies have fallen before. It weaves Israel's history into a shared regional style of boasting about triumphs over the mighty. And it quietly absorbs and reuses older language about underworld dead and ancestral spirits, folding that vocabulary into a story about land and legitimacy. When we read these passages slowly, we don't have to flatten them into either literal field notes on prehistoric giants or purely metaphorical rhetoric. They look more like layered memory, real groups who are perhaps unusually tall or simply renowned as fierce warriors, ancient names that accrued legendary weight, blending with ideas about the heroic dead. Political storytelling that magnified opponents so that their defeat would magnify the victor. Genealogies that claim lineage from, or victory over, these figures as a way of saying, "We belong here. Our God has given us this place." Deuteronomy's Tall People's Catalogue is not a monster manual. It is a carefully curated memory map, where lineages, legends and land claims intersect. As we move from here into the broader traditions about Anakim and Rephaim in Canaan, that merging of genealogy, propaganda and cultural memory will only become more intricate. If Deuteronomy gives us a catalogue, the rest of the Hebrew Bible lets us zoom in on the map. The names Anakim and Rephaim are not scattered randomly. They cling to certain regions, certain cities, certain ridgelines and valleys. Numbers 13 has already told us that the spies saw Anakim in the south, in what later texts call the hill country of Judah. Hebron in particular becomes Anakim territory. Joshua 11 and 14 will say that the Anakim lived in the hill country of Judah and Israel, from Hebron, Debir, Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Geographically, that's the spine of the Central Highlands, rugged, defensible, dotted with older Canaanite centres. In the memory world of Israel's storytellers, these ridges are not just topography, they're where the Anakim live. The Rephaim, by contrast, are usually placed further north and east. Bashan, with Og, the valley of Rephaim just southwest of Jerusalem, where David fights the Philistines. In Joshua, Rephaim are linked with the area around Jerusalem and with the broader Transjordan. If you were to sketch this onto a rough mental map of late Bronze and early Iron Age Canaan, you'd see pockets of tall people memory forming a kind of ring around the emerging Israelite heartland. Anakim to the south and in the central hills, Rephaim to the north, northeast, and just beyond the core. This doesn't give us biological data, it gives us remembered landscapes. When a story says, "This was once the land of the Anakim," it's doing what Deuteronomy did on a broader scale, layering history, legend, and identity onto a place. Hills become not just elevations, but former strongholds of intimidating others. Valleys become not just agricultural zones, but battlefields where God and Israel prove themselves against long-ago champions. Over time, these labels start to move. In Joshua, the Anakim are a conquered remnant. Joshua 11 declares that Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction. There were none of the Anakim left in the land of the Israelites. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. Earlier, in Numbers, the Anakim were an overwhelming obstacle. In Joshua, they are a defeated memory, with a few survivors pushed out to Philistine cities on the coastal plain. By the time we reach the stories of David, the name Anak doesn't appear, but we begin hearing about unusually tall warriors from Philistine territory, Goliath of Gath. Later, in 2 Samuel 21 and 1 Chronicles 20, a little cluster of descendants of the Rapha in Gath, each with impressive weapons and physical oddities. Here, the ethnic label has shifted. We're not told they're Anakim, we're told they're of the Rapha or of the Rephaim. The giant motif has migrated from Anakim in the hill country to Philistine champions on the coast, and the vocabulary flexes to accommodate it. This is one reason scholars are cautious about treating Anakim or rephaim as precise biological categories. The labels behave like traditions, not like entries in a genetics database. Sometimes rephaim is a broad, archaic people group in Transjordan. Sometimes it's the underworld dead in poetry. Sometimes it's a line of extraordinary warriors in Gath. Sometimes Anakim are the terrifying inhabitants of Canaan before Israel. Sometimes they are a defeated remnant, remembered mostly to magnify Joshua's success. The continuity is not in bloodlines we can trace, it's in the story function. Groups at the margins or in contested spaces are remembered and described as unusually tall, unusually fierce, somehow larger than life. Their names become shorthand for threat. There is a social logic to this. Borderlands are where anxieties concentrate. The southern hill country, the northern heights of Bashan, the Philistine cities along the coastal plain, these are edges between highland and lowland, between different political entities, between different ways of life. Edges are where raids come from, where wars break out, where the familiar gives way to the strange. In many cultures, stories about giants collect in these liminal zones. The people over there are not just those villagers across the valley. They are fierce, tall, warlike. They are like the Anakim. They are as the rephaim. To remember them that way is to dramatize the danger that lies at the border. This is othering, but not in a simple, cartoonish way. To call your neighbour's ancestors rephaim is to cast them as both impressive and ominous. It amplifies their stature so that pushing them back or surviving alongside them becomes a mark of your own legitimacy. It says, our fathers held their own against the kind of people you tell stories about. The spy report in Numbers plays into this psychology. The men are not just tall, they are men of great size. We were like grasshoppers in our own eyes. The physical difference is exaggerated, but that's how fear memory talks. When you face a skilled, better-armed opponent, your mind turns them into giants. At the same time, warrior reputation feeds back into height stereotypes. Elite fighters are often better nourished, better trained, and therefore, on average, somewhat taller and more imposing than the subsistence farms around them. A few striking individuals, men who are genuinely very tall for their population, can become reference points for whole groups. They're all like that over there. We see this looping pattern, real variation in physique and military strength, retold in language that stretches and magnifies, which then shapes how later generations perceive and categorize their neighbors. The biblical texts themselves bear witness to this layering. On one level, they agree. Anakim and Rephaim belong to the deep past of the land. They are associated with height, might, and displacement by newer populations. They mark off certain territories as once giant-haunted. On another level, they diverge. Deuteronomy uses Rephaim as an umbrella term for old peoples who are as tall as the Anakim, while poetic texts use Rephaim for shades in the underworld. Joshua pushes Anakim to Philistine cities. Later narratives assign Rephaim descent to Philistine warriors, and the Nephilim of Genesis 6 are briefly linked to the mighty men who are of old, men of renown, without any explicit tie to Anak or rephaim at all. These differences suggest that we're not dealing with a single, fixed tradition handed down mechanically. We're seeing multiple streams of memory, sometimes converging, sometimes crossing, each reusing the same evocative labels for slightly different narrative needs. Threaded through it all, we have to keep a quiet distinction in mind. Anakim and rephaim in these texts are traditions about groups, ways of talking about certain kinds of people in certain kinds of stories. They may at various points overlap with real biological populations that were taller on average, or more militarized, or simply older and more established. But the biblical language does not behave like a modern biological category. It behaves like cultural memory. Once we recognize that, the map of ancient Canaan comes into focus not as a distribution of literal giant races, but as a landscape dense with remembered others. Hill towns and border valleys carry names that recall intimidating predecessors, stories of height, and might become ways of thinking about threat, about courage, about who belongs and why. And into that landscape, later interpreters will begin to read something even more dramatic. Not just tall ancestors and fierce neighbours, but the lingering footprint of heavenly beings gone wrong. That turn, to watchers, to forbidden unions, to an expanded backstory for the giants, is where the tradition takes its next, strange step. When later Jewish writers went looking for that next, strange step, one book in particular became the workshop, what we now call 1 Enoch. It's not part of the Hebrew Bible as Jewish communities eventually defined it. In most Christian traditions it lives at the margins, quoted, echoed, debated, but not placed between Genesis and Exodus. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, however, it is scripture. In Second Temple Judaism, more broadly, it was simply one of the books that serious people read. Fragments of 1 Enoch show up among the Dead Sea Scrolls. New Testament authors seem to know it. Early Christian thinkers quote it as though it explains things Genesis leaves unsaid. Whatever we think of its truth claims, historically it mattered. It tells us not what really happened in some prehistoric age, but how one stream of ancient readers filled in the silence around Genesis 6. In 1 Enoch, the vague sons of God become a named group, the Watchers. They begin as loyal heavenly beings assigned to observe the earth, to watch over humanity. The very title Watcher carries a sense of vigilance, guardianship, almost priestly attention. But in the Book of the Watchers, the first major section of 1 Enoch, that vocation curdles. A leader named Shemihaza persuades 200 Watchers to descend from their post and take human women as wives. The text slows down over their decision. They hesitate. They know it is a transgression. They bind themselves with oaths on a mountain so that none will back out. In Genesis, they took wives, is a single line. In Enoch, it becomes a moral drama. Heavenly beings choosing to cross a boundary they were meant to guard. Once they come down, they do more than marry. They teach. One by one, the Watchers are assigned forbidden subjects. Metalworking, weaponsmithing, cosmetics, enchantments, astrology, the knowledge of roots, and cutting of herbs. On the surface, these are skills and sciences. But in the Enochic imagination, this is too much, too quickly, in the wrong hands. Knowledge is not neutral here. It has a timetable. Certain techniques, especially those that intensify violence, manipulate sexuality, or try to control fate, belong to God alone. When the Watchers reveal them, they short-circuit the slow education of the human race. Civilization becomes weaponized overnight. Out of these unions between Watchers and women come beings that 1 Enoch is not afraid to call giants. They are not just tall, they are insatiable. The text describes them as devouring everything. First human labor, then the herds, then wild animals, finally turning on humans themselves. Their hunger is a symbol more than a zoological detail. It signals what happens when power is unleashed without restraint, consumption without limit, appetite that can't be folded back into a stable world. Violence follows naturally. The giants fill the earth with bloodshed. They corrupt animals, they corrupt human minds, they disrupt the patterns of the heavens. In Genesis, the diagnosis before the flood is brief. The earth was filled with violence. In Enoch, that line is unpacked into a whole cascade. Illicit instruction, arrogant hybrid offspring, cosmic disorder. The giants become an image of what you might call systemic evil, not just individual wrongdoing, but a distortion so deep that creation itself is out of joint. In that context, the flood takes on a sharper, if darker, logic. In Genesis, readers have long wrestled with the question, why such a total judgment? Why drown the whole world? The text itself offers a theological answer: human wickedness, every inclination of the heart turned to evil. But it does not dwell on mechanisms or intermediaries. 1 Enoch steps into that gap. The earth cries out against the giants. The souls of the dead appeal to heaven. The archangels of God report what the watchers have done. God's response is not impulsive, it's judicial. The decision to send the flood is framed as a response to a chain of corruptions that began with heavenly disobedience and ran through technological misuse, sexual transgression, and predatory rule. The flood in this retelling is less a mysterious catastrophe and more a massive act of cleansing, a way to remove from the earth a generation that does not belong and to imprison the watchers who taught humanity to move so quickly towards self-destruction. At the same time, 1 Enoch does something subtle with blame. It doesn't excuse human beings. Humans embrace the forbidden knowledge. They act on it. They benefit from it. But the book does locate the initial spark of certain evils: warfare on an industrial scale, magical manipulation, the twisting of beauty into harm, in the choice of heavenly beings to abandon their place. For the communities who cherish these stories, this reframing may have helped answer an old question. Why is the world so tangled if God is just? The Enochic answer is, because some of the powers that were meant to guard you betrayed their commission, and because once certain kinds of knowledge are loose, they cannot be easily called back. Historically, this way of reading Genesis 6 spread widely. At Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve multiple copies of 1 Enoch and other Watcher texts. The community there seems to have woven the Watcher's story into its own self-understanding, seeing contemporary corrupt leaders as heirs of that ancient rebellion. In early Christianity, the letter of Jude alludes directly to angels who did not keep their own position, but abandoned their proper dwelling, language that sounds very close to 1 Enoch. Church writers like Tertullian and Irenaeus read the Nephilim through an Enochic lens. Others, like later rabbis, were more cautious or outright dismissive, preferring to keep interpretive distance. Across Jewish and Christian traditions, 1 Enoch's status remained uneven. Revered in some circles, sidelined in others, canonized fully only in the Ethiopian church. But its imagery, watchers, giants, illicit arts, the prison of rebellious angels, continue to echo long after the book itself slipped out of most Bibles. From a historical standpoint, it's important to keep the categories clear. 1 Enoch is interpretive literature. It tells us how some ancient Jews in the centuries before and around the time of Jesus thought about Genesis 6, about evil, and about the flood. It does not provide independent proof that cosmic beings took human wives, or that there was a global population of hybrid giants devouring the earth. What it does show, vividly, is how a brief, puzzling line in Genesis could unfold into an elaborate moral narrative. Height becomes hunger. Mighty men of old become symbols of predatory elites. Sons of God become watchers, whose tragedy is to abandon the boundary between heaven and earth. In filling Genesis's silence, Enoch does not settle the question of what happened, but it does let us listen in on how ancient communities wrestled with the same unease that many modern readers feel, the sense that behind the giants, behind the violence, lies a story about misused power and the long shadow it casts over the human world. In the next phase of the tradition, those debates will move from the pages of 1 Enoch into wider Jewish thought. Some will lean into the angelic reading, others will pull back toward more human explanations. Genesis 6 becomes a crossroads, and Second Temple interpreters begin to choose their paths. As we move into that wider landscape, something becomes clear very quickly. There was no single, settled way to tell this story. Second Temple Judaism was not a monolith. It was a crowded house. You had priestly circles in Jerusalem invested in temple ritual and sacrificial calendars. You had scribal schools copying and interpreting the Torah. You had apocalyptic groups dreaming of imminent divine intervention. You had sages emphasizing wisdom, self-control, and halakha, practical law for daily life. You had the emerging Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and circles we can barely name. All of them read Genesis. Many of them read, or at least heard, echoes of Enochic traditions. But they did not all draw the same map. The Watcher's storyline is one example of that diversity. In some circles, like the community at Qumran, the Enochic version becomes central. Their writings fold the fall of the Watchers into a larger narrative about cosmic dualism, sons of light versus sons of darkness, faithful angels versus fallen ones, pure priesthood versus corrupt temple authorities. For them, demons are not just vague forces, they are often the lingering spirits of the giants, the after-effects of that ancient transgression. Angelology becomes sharply defined. Ranks of loyal angels, named archangels, and a shadow side of bound or rebellious beings. Ritual purity in that framework is not only about washing and avoiding certain foods, it is about drawing firm lines against the influence of hostile spiritual powers. Other Jewish writers are more reserved. Ben Sira, a wisdom teacher from the early 2nd century BCE, certainly knows Genesis and may have known stories like those in Enoch. But in his book, evil is largely framed in terms of human choice, folly, and the temptations of wealth and power. Cosmic rebellion is in the background, if present at all. The focus is on the heart, the tongue, the path of the righteous versus the path of the wicked. The Book of Jubilees, another text from this period, takes a middle path. It retells Genesis in a tight chronological framework, divided into jubilees of years, and it does include Watchers and giants. But it also carefully manages their impact. Angelic sin is acknowledged and then contained. The emphasis falls back on Israel's covenant, on law, on the idea that faithfulness to the divinely given calendar and commandments can shield a community in a morally dangerous world. Across these writings, demonology and angelology are changing. Earlier biblical books speak rarely of demons and only occasionally of angels. By the Second Temple period, those categories have expanded. Angels gain names, roles, and hierarchies. Some texts describe them as heavenly priests, others as warriors, others as interpreters of visions. Demons, too, are more clearly personified. Sometimes they are tied to the giants, as in Enoch and Jubilees. Sometimes they are more like personifications of disease, temptation, or chaos. But almost everywhere they become part of the conversation about why the world feels precarious and about why purity matters. Purity itself is also being rethought. In the Torah, purity laws govern contact with corpses, bodily fluids, certain animals. In the Second Temple period, those regulations remain, but new layers of meaning accumulate. For apocalyptic groups, impurity can mark the encroachment of evil powers. For more legalistic traditions, it can define who is inside or outside the community's covenantal order. rituals of washing, food rules, and marriage boundaries are not only about health or symbolic order, they're also about protecting a fragile identity in a world perceived as spiritually contested. Stories about the Watchers and Nephilim are taken up and repurposed within that concern. For some, they become a way to talk about corrupt elites, kings and rulers whose violence feels larger than life. For others, they are a warning about forbidden knowledge and intermarriage, a mythic mirror of contemporary anxieties about mixing with foreign nations or adopting foreign customs. And not everyone agrees on what kind of story Genesis 6 even is. Some readers lean fully into cosmic rebellion. For them, the sons of God really are heavenly beings, and the Nephilim really are their monstrous offspring. The tale is a spiritual origin story for the evil that seems to saturate the earth. Others begin to treat it more allegorically. Heavenly sons of God might represent powerful human judges or tyrants. The giants might stand for oppressive aristocrats, tall in reputation more than in bone. The moral centre shifts from angelic transgression to human arrogance and injustice. Still others keep the focus almost entirely on human sin. They might acknowledge strange traditions about angels, but when they preach and write, the point they stress is that humans chose violence, humans embraced idolatry, humans filled the earth with blood. For them, importing elaborate angelic dramas risks distracting from the basic ethical demand. Turn away from injustice, return to the covenant. The result is a spectrum of interpretations rather than a single authorized line. From a distance, that diversity can look untidy. It might be tempting to ask, which view did ancient Jews really hold? But that question misfires. There was no central committee issuing official explanations. There were overlapping communities, each reading the same brief text, each hearing something slightly different. In a living religious landscape, that kind of textual plurality is normal. Sacred stories, especially the strange ones, act like prisms. They take the white light of shared tradition and refract it into different colours, depending on context. A group under foreign rule might hear in the Watcher's tale a critique of imperial power. A community obsessed with ritual precision might hear a warning about boundary crossing in marriage, food, and worship. A philosopher might treat it as a parable about the dangers of unregulated desire and unearned knowledge. All of them are, in a sense, hearing the same words. All of them are also, in practice, telling slightly different stories. This is a good place for a quiet checkpoint. When we ask what the Bible says about the Nephilim, or what ancient Jews believed about fallen angels, we are already simplifying a landscape that was, on the ground, complex and contested. Genesis 6 stood at a crossroads, and Second Temple interpreters walked different paths from that junction. Some followed the road of cosmic rebellion and detailed angelic hierarchies. Some took the path of allegory and moral symbolism. Some stayed close to the human surface of the text and let angels fade into the background. Recognizing that plurality doesn't solve the mystery, but it does change its shape. Instead of searching for a single, hidden, ancient answer, we begin to see a conversation, long, layered, sometimes sharp, about power, purity, and the blurry line between human and more than human forces. As we step beyond Jewish literature into the surrounding cultures of the ancient Near East, that conversation widens further. Other peoples, too, remembered ages of sages and semi-divine figures, builders and kings whose stature seemed larger than life. Their stories will give us another angle on why giants and heavenly beings so often travel together in ancient memory. When scholars look for family resemblances to the Watcher's story, their eyes are often drawn east, to the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates. There, in Mesopotamian traditions that are older than the final form of Genesis, we meet another set of strange figures, the Apkallu. The word Apkallu is usually translated as sage or wise one. In the oldest layers of the tradition, they are not ordinary humans. They are semi-divine culture bringers, associated with the god of wisdom, Ea or Enki. In some texts they appear as fishmen, with human bodies draped in the skin of a great fish. In others they look more like human priests or bird-headed spirits. What they share is a role. In Sumerian and Akkadian sources, especially in lists of early kings and in ritual texts, the Apkallu are remembered as the ones who brought civilization's toolkit. They taught humans how to build cities, how to write, how to perform temple rituals, how to read omens, how to order the world so that gods and humans could coexist without chaos. They stand in Mesopotamian memory at the dawn of culture, exactly where Genesis 6 and Enoch place the Watchers. There are also flood stories in the background. In the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, and in related traditions, we hear about a great deluge that nearly wiped out humanity. The hero Utnapishtim survives in a boat built with divine instruction. In some later lists, the Apkallu belong to the antediluvian age, the time before the flood. After the flood, the texts sometimes shift language. Instead of fully divine sages, we start hearing about wise men, human descendants or successors of the Apkallu who continue their work in a humbler key. So we have a pattern: semi-divine beings, associated with wisdom, living before a cataclysmic flood, teaching humanity the arts of civilization. For readers who know the Watcher's story in 1 Enoch, that pattern sounds familiar. There too heavenly beings descend in the days before the flood. They teach humans skills and knowledge, metallurgy, cosmetics, enchantments, astrology. They cross a boundary, take human wives, and produce a violent hybrid offspring. Their teaching is not simply a gift, it is a transgression. Wisdom becomes weaponized. Knowledge that should have remained in heaven floods the earth, and the flood that follows is a kind of reset. The Apkallu and the Watchers are not identical, but they move in similar narrative space. Both represent a meeting point between the divine and human realms. Both are linked to specialized knowledge. Both stand near flood traditions, and both carry a note of ambivalence. Civilization is good. Temples, writing, ritual order, crafts, these are celebrated in Mesopotamian texts. But the very experts who mediate this knowledge are never simply neutral. In some incantations, the Apkallu stand on the side of protection. In other contexts, associated figures can be dangerous, bearers of secrets that cut both ways. It is easy at this point to jump straight to a conclusion, to say that Genesis 6 is just a Hebrew version of an older Mesopotamian myth, or that the Watchers are simply rebranded Apkallu. The reality is probably more tangled and more interesting. Ancient Israel did not develop in a vacuum. Across the first millennium BCE, Judean scribes lived under or beside empires that told and retold Mesopotamian stories. Flood myths, king lists, tales of sages and heroes would have circulated in one form or another. It would be surprising if no motifs ever crossed linguistic and cultural borders. At the same time, parallel stories do not automatically mean direct borrowing. Sometimes cultures breathe the same air. Floods, in a region shaped by river systems and seasonal extremes, are common experiences. Kings and priests everywhere have an interest in claiming that their wisdom comes from beyond the merely human. When people reflect on where their laws, rituals and crafts came from, it makes intuitive sense to picture an older, higher race of teachers, neither fully God nor fully man. In that context, similar story shapes can arise more than once. So when we notice echoes between Apkallu and Watchers, semi-divine sages, pre-flood setting, ambivalent knowledge, it is reasonable to suspect some kind of interaction or shared background, but it is methodologically cautious to stop short of saying, this text is a one-to-one rewrite of that one. Texts move through time. They are adapted, trimmed, argued with, and repurposed. A Judean writer who had heard versions of Mesopotamian Apkallu tales might borrow a few elements and invert their moral. Where the Apkallu are credited with founding cities and cults, Genesis 6 might hint that the descent of sons of God leads to violence and judgment, where Mesopotamian tradition can be proud of its deep priestly wisdom, an Enochic writer can ask whether some wisdom is, in fact, too heavy for humans to carry without disaster. Even the flood itself becomes part of that conversation. In Mesopotamia, the flood is sometimes framed as the gods' overreaction, later regretted, a near erasure of a noisy humanity. In Genesis, it becomes a moral cleansing of a world filled with violence. Around these pivot points, different cultures place their sages and semi-divine teachers, asking in their own ways, what went wrong with knowledge? Where is the line between instruction and corruption, between guidance and overreach? Noticing these patterns does not prove that the same supernatural being stood behind all the stories. It does something quieter. It shows us that, across the ancient Near East, people wrestled with the same bundle of questions. How did we get our skills, our rituals, our technologies? Are our most powerful forms of knowledge safe, or dangerous, or both? What happens when the boundary between heavenly and earthly beings blurs? The Apkallu traditions give one set of answers. The Watcher's tale gives another. Lined up side by side, they do not collapse into each other. Instead, they illuminate shared themes, a regional worry about wisdom, transgression and flood, without requiring us to treat them as carbon copies of a single lost event. From here, we can follow those themes into one more neighbouring cluster of stories, tales of giant kings and heroic ages, where the line between mythic sage, monstrous warrior, and royal propaganda becomes even harder to draw. When we turn from sages to warriors, from Apkallu to giants, we find that the ancient Near East is thick with figures who blur the line between man and more than man. In Mesopotamian tradition, Gilgamesh himself is a good place to start. The epic calls him 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. Later King Lis stretch his reign to fantastical lengths. He is not just a strong ruler, he belongs to a different scale of existence. The same list that mention Apkallu before the flood also mention antediluvian kings ruling for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reign lengths shrink, divinity recedes, and kings look more like us. The overall shape is clear. There was once an age when rulers were taller in story, longer in life, closer to the gods. Egypt offers its own version of this pattern. Pharaohs are not usually described as giants in a literal sense, but they are sons of gods, embodiments of Horus, linked by inscriptions to primeval kings who ruled before the first historical dynasties. In some temple hymns and foundation texts, architects and priests anchor the current ruler's authority in a deep mythic past where ancestral kings subdued chaos monsters, tamed the Nile, or built the first shrines with the help of divine craftsmen. In the Levant and Anatolia, we find heroic figures like the Hurrian Hittite Kumabi cycle's gods and champions, or Ugaritic Baal and his allies, battling sea and death. Their immediate concern is cosmic order, but royal houses mirror them. A mortal dynasty presents itself as the earthly continuation of a divine heroic age. To say, our founder fought like Baal, is to say he belongs in that older, brighter layer of time when gods and titans shaped the world. Against this backdrop, the biblical phrase Gibborim, men of name, the mighty men of old, men of renown, starts to sound less like a biological report and more like a way of placing certain figures inside that same imaginative geography. Ancient audiences knew what it meant to speak of an earlier time, when people were greater, braver, closer to heaven. Hesiod, in Greek tradition, would later speak of a golden age, then a silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. In the heroic age, semi-divine warriors like Heracles and Achilles stride across the landscape, larger than ordinary mortals even when the texts don't give exact measurements. Their size is moral and narrative before it is anatomical. They occupy a scale where the everyday rules bend. The Hebrew Bible, especially in its brief passing references, seems to assume a similar horizon of expectation. When Genesis 6 mentions mighty men of old, the point is likely not to settle their height in centimetres. It is to say, the strange union of sons of God and human women produced the kind of figures people talk about in heroic stories, the kind of warriors and chiefs whose names echo in campfire tales. Whether any individual reached 7 feet, 8 feet, or simply felt that way in memory, the language is tapping into a shared way of talking about a lost, more intense world. Kings and elites had strong incentives to claim that world as their own ancestry. If a ruler can say, "I stand in the line of those mighty ones," he does more than boast. He roots his regime in a time before ordinary history. Mesopotamian royal inscriptions regularly stitch living kings into genealogies that run back through legendary rulers to the gods. Assyrian kings are strong men, lion hunters, conquerors whose deeds are framed as the renewal of feats performed by ancient heroes. Hittite and Aramean rulers trace their houses to culture heroes or god-favoured ancestors. To be king is to inherit not just land but a story, preferably one that begins when the world was young. Monuments shore up that claim. Across the Near East, royal power expresses itself in scale. City walls so thick that chariots could ride along the top, temples with stones heavier than any ordinary construction would require, statues of kings towering over petitioners. None of this necessarily reflects actual human size. It reflects political theatre. Monumentality makes the present regime feel anchored in deep time. It whispers that this house, this god, this dynasty has always been here, towering, inevitable. Later generations often reinterpret the theatre as evidence of literal giants. Stand at the foot of a colossal statue, look up at a royal inscription boasting of superhuman strength, and it is natural to imagine rulers of huge stature building with their bare hands. When biblical texts mention rephaim or Anakim, associated with certain regions and fortified cities, they are moving in that same mental landscape where big stones and old ruins are the footprints of great ones. Conquest stories make use of this. From Egypt to Assyria, military inscriptions swell the size and ferocity of enemies in order to magnify victory. Pharaohs speak of foes as innumerable, mighty, terrifying, only to be crushed by the king's valour and the favour of the gods. Assyrian annals depict conquered peoples as strong like wild bulls before they are yoked and led in chains. The greater the opponent, the greater the glory of subduing them. The Hebrew conquest narratives participate in this rhetoric, but often with a twist. Spies in Numbers 13 describe Canaanites as giants, sons of Anak, making Israel seem like grasshoppers. The language amplifies fear and underscores the apparent impossibility of the task. Later, when Deuteronomy recalls the dispossession of tall peoples east of the Jordan, the effect is to say, "Your God has already dealt with nations that seemed unbeatable, descendants of the very mighty ones people whisper about. The more formidable the foe in memory, the more impressive the deliverance." Over time, these strands, heroic exaggeration, royal genealogy, monumental architecture and conquest rhetoric, braid together into something that looks, from a distance, like a single tradition of giant peoples. What might have begun as a way of talking about an age of heroes becomes, in some cases, a genealogical claim. Ruling houses trace their lines to semi-divine champions. Local populations remember that in the old days there were huge men who built the nearby ruins. Scribes working with inherited lists and legends slot those memories into their accounts of the distant past, sometimes with a nudge of irony, sometimes with a sober theological point. When Genesis mentions mighty men of old, when later texts speak of rephaim and Anakim, we are probably not being given a neutral catalogue of abnormal skeletons. We are being invited into a world where power legitimizes itself by reaching back into a heroic age, where stories about extraordinary ancestors make present authority feel weighty and inevitable. Seen this way, giant traditions are less about measuring bones and more about managing memory. They tell us how ancient societies imagine the distance between now and then, between ordinary humans and those first, larger-than-life figures who supposedly tamed chaos, built cities, and fought impossible wars, and they prepare the ground for the next layers of tradition, where those memories will be reworked yet again, in later folklore, in apocryphal tales, and in the imaginations of people trying to make sense of old stones, old stories, and the hints of a vanished heroic world. As the centuries roll on, those hints of a vanished heroic world don't stay put. They are picked up, turned over, and retold by new communities with new concerns. By the medieval period, Jewish, Christian, and later Islamic storytellers are all working with the same small cluster of biblical verses about the Nephilim and the sons of God, plus the expanded Watcher traditions in books like 1 Enoch. But what had been brief allusions and austere warnings in earlier texts begin to grow branches. In some Jewish midrashim, the generation of the flood becomes populated with colourful figures. The Watchers descend with specific names and recognisable personalities. They teach not just secret knowledge in general, but particular crafts. How to make weapons, mix cosmetics, read the stars. The women they marry are sometimes given motives and backstories. The Nephilim themselves acquire a more concrete look. Towering warriors whose appetites are insatiable, whose violence becomes a cautionary mirror for human arrogance. Christian writers, especially in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, inherit both the biblical text and fragments of these older traditions. Some, like Augustine, are suspicious of angel-human unions and push interpretations toward more metaphorical readings. Sons of God as powerful men, daughters of humans as ordinary women seduced by status. Others are more willing to let the supernatural edge of the story stand and then fill in the gaps with moral detail. Over time, the Nephilim and Watchers become teaching tools. They illustrate the dangers of forbidden knowledge, of crossing divinely set boundaries, of confusing creature and creator. The abstract great men of old harden into individual characters placed in recognizable moral dramas. This is one reason later legends are so much richer in specificity than the terse lines of Genesis. Once a story is used for instruction and entertainment, it tends to sprout details. Names proliferate. Azazel, Shemazai, and others emerge as leaders of the rebellious Watchers. Their sins are catalogued. Their punishments are described in vivid, sometimes frightening language. Storytellers add exact numbers for the giants' heights, sometimes reaching absurd dimensions. Later pious handbooks might say a Nephilim was 3, 10, or even hundreds of cubits tall. Hyperbole that once lived between the lines is pulled into the foreground. Places solidify too. Local landscapes exert a quiet gravity on these traditions. If you live near a massive tumbled ruin whose builders are forgotten, it is tempting to connect it with the old stories you already know. Throughout the Mediterranean and the Near East, travellers' reports and local folklore tie particular caves, dolmens, and cyclopean walls to the giants of old. Prehistoric tombs in the Levant become, in some memories, resting places of the rephaim. Megalithic circles or single colossal standing stones are sometimes called giants' tables, giants' chairs, or giants' fingers. In Europe, Roman ruins acquire legends of titanic builders. In the Islamic world, certain impressive ancient sites are linked in popular imagination to the people of Ad or to antediluvian giants. The same mechanism is at work in many places. An unusual feature of the landscape invites explanation. Old stones plus an old story naturally produce a local legend. It's important to note that most of these associations are late and layered. A medieval traveller might be told that a particular hill contains the bones of a Nephilim. A pilgrim might visit a cave where locals say a fallen angel once lived in chains. Such accounts tell us a great deal about medieval imagination and devotion. They tell us almost nothing certain about the Bronze Age realities behind the biblical texts. Moral lessons continue to reshape the material. In Christian hagiographies, giants sometimes appear as personifications of pagan strength, defeated by saints through prayer rather than sword. The saint's victory over a huge enemy dramatizes the triumph of humility over brute force, of the true God over the old gods of the land. In some Jewish tales, the descendants of the giants linger at the margins of history as tragic or comical figures, reminders that greatness without righteousness leads to ruin. In Islamic storytelling, echoes of the Watchers and Nephilim get woven into broader patterns about peoples destroyed by God for their pride and injustice. The underlying theological questions about divine justice, human responsibility, and the nature of evil are serious, but the narrative vehicles carrying those questions often become more elaborate, more concrete, more entertaining as time goes on. That is one of the basic dynamics of folklore. Sparse, suggestive texts invite ornate retellings. We can watch the process. What begins as "there were mighty men in those days" slowly becomes, "here is the name of one, here is the valley where he fell, here is the length of his spear, here is the stone he threw that still lies by the road." Measurements, which are almost entirely absent from the earliest layers, appear with increasing frequency. A giant's bed is said to be 9 cubits long. A skull is so large that 3 men can stand inside it. A footprint sinks a handbreadth into solid rock. These figures are rarely about careful observation. They are a way of quantifying awe. For someone trying to reconstruct the past in a historical sense, this creates a challenge. We have at least 3 different layers to keep distinct. There is devotional tradition, the way communities of faith remember and reinterpret scripture and earlier texts, often through liturgy, preaching, and popular piety. This layer can treasure and transmit very old ideas, but it also reshapes them in every generation. There is folklore, stories told at the level of villages, families, and regions, attaching myths to specific hills, springs, and ruins. Folklore is sensitive to the local environment and to the needs of storytelling, humour, fear, wonder, identity. And there is academic historical reconstruction, the modern attempt using philology, archaeology, and comparative study to understand what the oldest texts likely meant in their own contexts, and what, if anything, they preserve of real events or social memories. None of these layers is simply right or wrong. Each has its own logic and value. Devotional tradition explores what these stories mean for a community's relationship with the divine. Folklore shows how people inhabit their landscapes and imagine their past. Historical study asks what we can responsibly say about how and why the stories first took shape. Seen across this spectrum, the Nephilim become less a fixed group and more a flexible symbol. In some eras, they stand for unrestrained violence before the flood. In others, they become emblems of corrupt knowledge, or of the proud enemies God brings low, or of the vanished greatness of a land's pre-conquest inhabitants. Sometimes they are simply the mysterious they who built the old wall or carved the strange stone. The same few verses in Genesis, the same watcher stories in books like one Enoch, echo through monasteries, synagogues, mosques, and marketplaces, picking up new accents as they go. Each retelling answers a slightly different question. Why is the world the way it is? Why are there ruins here? Why do the wicked prosper for a time? Why do boundaries matter? By listening carefully to those later echoes, and by setting them alongside the biblical texts and the older Near Eastern parallels, we can begin to see both continuity and change. The old heroic age never quite disappears. It is continually reimagined. And the figures who once strode through that age, the Nephilim, the mighty men of old, continue to serve as a kind of mirror, reflecting back whatever a given community most wants to say about power, pride, judgment, and the long shadow of the past. If we step away from the legends for a moment and walk into a quiet museum storeroom, the conversation changes. Here, the giants we can actually study are bones laid out on padded tables, labelled with accession numbers and excavation codes. Archaeology, at its most concrete, is not about rumours of huge skeletons dragged from caves. It is about measurable things, long bones whose length can be recorded, teeth that preserve childhood stresses, vertebrae that show how a spine carried its weight. From human remains, osteologists can estimate stature with reasonable accuracy. They measure femurs, tibias, humeri, and apply formulas built from thousands of known cases. They can then compare those estimates across cemeteries, regions, and time periods. This is how we know, for instance, that many populations in the ancient Near East were not dramatically shorter than modern humans, but they were, on average, somewhat smaller and more lightly built than people in well-nourished industrial societies. Bones also tell a subtler story. Lines in tooth enamel show episodes of childhood malnutrition or illness. Certain lesions on the skeleton point to chronic infections or heavy labour. Joint wear can reveal a life spent carrying loads, grinding grain, or marching long distances. When you put hundreds of skeletons together statistically, you can begin to see patterns, periods when average height drops because nutrition worsens, times when it rises with better agriculture or more stable food supplies. In that sense, archaeology can sketch something like a height map for the ancient world. For the Bronze and Iron Age Levant, where the biblical stories are set, that map looks fairly ordinary. Adult men often cluster somewhere around 5'3" to 5'6". Many women are a few inches shorter. There is variation, of course. Some people push past 5'9", a few towards 6 feet or a bit beyond. But we do not find an entire stratum of 8 or 10-foot humans populating the hills of Canaan. And yet, unusual height does occur. Even without modern medical care, some individuals grow very tall. Genetic variation alone makes it possible for someone in a community of 5 feet 4 inches men to reach 6 feet 4 inches or more. That person, in daily life, would feel immense. They would look down on their neighbours quite literally. They might become a warrior, a champion, a guard at a city gate. Their armour, their bed, their spear could easily become famous. On top of ordinary variation, there are also pathological conditions that produce extreme stature. Certain tumours of the pituitary gland can cause acromegaly or gigantism. These disorders are rare, but they do show up in the archaeological record. A few skeletal finds from different parts of the ancient world show the telltale signs: overgrown long bones, enlarged joints, particular changes in the skull. So when ancient texts talk about individuals of imposing height, archaeology does not force us to deny that possibility. Very tall people have always existed. What it does not give us so far is evidence of whole populations of true giants scattered across the Levant. That brings us to the modern tales of giant bones that circulate in books, websites, and late-night conversations. From an archaeological perspective, the key issue is not whether someone claims to have seen a large bone. The key issue is provenance and documentation. Where exactly was it found? In what layer of soil, alongside what other remains under whose supervision, with which records kept. A credible find leaves a long paper trail. Professional excavations document their work obsessively. Grid coordinates, photographs, soil descriptions, field notebooks, lab reports. If a skeleton of exceptional height were uncovered in a controlled dig, its existence would not rest on a single photograph or an anecdote. It would be embedded in a context with multiple witnesses and archived records. Museums build on that same culture of documentation. When they accession human remains, they log the site, the excavator, the date, the associated artifacts. Researchers who want to study unusual skeletons must usually publish their findings in peer-reviewed journals. That process is not perfect, but it does require that methods be described, measurements reported, and interpretations open to critique by other specialists. When we look at the most dramatic giant skeleton claims through that lens, a pattern emerges. They tend to lack clear provenance. The alleged bones are no longer available for study, or their chain of custody is murky. Images turn out, on closer inspection, to be misinterpreted, mislabeled, or digitally altered. Stories grow in the telling, much like the medieval legends about skulls that could hold 3 men. This does not mean that museums are hiding vast collections of giant remains. It means that extraordinary claims about the past have to pass through the same narrow gate as any other scientific claim: careful excavation, transparent records, and independent verification. Most do not. At the same time, we should be cautious with another kind of overconfidence, the sense that our tape measures can fully capture what ancient people meant by giant. Stature is always relative. In a community where most men are 5 feet 3 inches, someone who stands 5 feet 10 inches and is heavily muscled will feel enormous. If that person also holds power, wears distinctive armor, or comes from a feared group, their physical presence and social weight fuse together. A generation later, when people tell stories about them, the remembered height and the remembered awe are difficult to disentangle. We also have to remember that the biblical writers were not publishing anthropometric surveys. They were describing enemies, ancestors, and wonders. Giants could be a way of saying, they seemed overpowering. They were unlike us. They made us feel small. Archaeology and osteology can help set boundaries. They show us what human bodies in the ancient Levant were typically like, how tall they tended to be, how disease and diet shaped them. They show that truly exceptional height is possible, but rare. They do not on their own prove or disprove the Nephilim as theological beings, or the Watchers as figures of rebellion. What they offer is a sober backdrop. Against that backdrop, the biblical language of giants stands out in relief, as a mixture of biology, perception, and cultural memory. The bones remind us what ordinary humans looked like. The texts remind us how extraordinary humans, real or imagined, could be woven into stories that still haunt the imagination. And when we turn from bones back to stones, from skeletons to the massive ruins and megaliths that dot the ancient landscape, the questions about giants take on a different shape yet again. Walk through almost any ancient landscape long enough, and you eventually meet a stone that seems unreasonable. A single block the size of a small house, resting 3 meters off the ground in a temple wall. A ring of standing stones, each weighing dozens of tons, aligned with uncanny precision. A burial chamber roofed with a slab so massive it feels like it should crack the earth beneath it. In places like this, the question rises almost automatically: who could have built this? For many people, the first answer is not patient farmers with ropes and ramps. It is giants, or gods, or some older lost race that knew secrets we no longer possess. The stones seem to demand an explanation that is as heavy, as strange as they are. We see this pattern almost everywhere, in the Levant, in Europe, in the Andes, in Polynesia. Where there are megaliths, there are stories of beings larger than life. Part of the reason is simple scale. When you stand next to a 40-ton block that has been lifted and fitted into a wall, your body knows its own limits. You can feel in your bones and tendons how much you can move, how far you can push, what you could drag with 10 friends. The stone exceeds all of that. It is not just big. It is bigger than your sense of what ordinary human effort can accomplish. And when our direct experience fails, imagination steps in. Yet when archaeologists and engineers look at these same stones, something different happens. They start breaking the problem into pieces. Any heavy object can be moved if you have enough time, enough people, and a way to reduce friction. Logs as rollers, sledges dragged over wet clay or sand, ropes braided from plant fibers that, when multiplied by hundreds of hands, can pull astonishing loads. Leverage does the rest. A small stone used as a fulcrum, a length of wood as a lever, will lift weights our muscles alone could never budge. Stack the fulcrums, adjust the levers, and a block can be inched upward, slowly, over days or weeks. Ramps, earthen, stone, or timber, turn vertical problems into long, shallow slopes. What feels like the work of a moment in myth is, in reality, the work of seasons. We have modern experiments that show this in practice. Small teams have moved multi-ton stones with nothing more exotic than wooden sledges, earthen ramps, and simple pulleys. Scale those teams up to hundreds or thousands of labourers organised under a central authority, and suddenly the impossible begins to look like logistics. That word, organised, may be the most important piece. Megalithic structures are less about superhuman strength than about social engineering. Someone has to survey the site, plan the layout, coordinate quarrying, assign work crews, arrange food and water, maintain tools, enforce schedules, manage injuries, and keep people motivated over years of back-breaking effort. The true miracle behind a great stone monument is not a single giant lifting a rock. It is 1,000 ordinary bodies cooperating for a shared goal. But our minds do not naturally tell stories about committees and supply chains. Who could have built this becomes a storytelling engine. It invites answers that are about extraordinary beings rather than ordinary systems. We see this in texts from the ancient Near East. Late Babylonian and Assyrian writings sometimes look at ruined cities and attribute them to primordial sages or heroic kings, figures who straddle the line between human and divine. Greek writers walk through the shattered walls of Mycenaean Tiryns and decide that ordinary men could not have lifted such stones. They imagine Cyclopes, one-eyed giants from a more elemental age, working as master masons. The biblical world is no different. The ruins of older Canaanite cities, collapsed walls and abandoned high places would have dotted the landscape for centuries. Israelite and Judahite writers inherited a land already layered with monuments and memories. When they spoke of rephaim, of Anakim, of fallen mighty ones from long ago, they were also speaking into a terrain full of mute stone witnesses. Later, Jewish and Christian traditions amplify this tendency. The watchers in 1 Enoch are not just teachers of forbidden knowledge. Their offspring leave behind traces in the form of weapons, cities, technologies. Medieval and early modern folklore all across Europe routinely assigns earthworks, hill forts, and stone circles to giants. In many cases we can now date those same structures and see that they were built by perfectly ordinary Bronze or Iron Age communities. But the stories cling to them anyway. Interestingly, ancient people themselves often practiced this same kind of retroactive attribution. A later city might rise atop the ruins of an earlier one. Its inhabitants, unsure of exactly who had built the foundations beneath their feet, might speak of a race of heroes, or of a king whose reign was longer than normal lifetimes, or of beings who were like gods. The further back the builder receded into memory, the larger they became. These monument myths, then, tell us something important, not about hidden non-human architects, but about human cultural memory. They are ways of anchoring identity in a landscape. To say, our ancestors built this when they were mighty, or a race of giants once lived here, is to weave your present community into a much older story. The stones become proof, not of engineering skill, but of chosenness, of former glory, of divine judgment. Whether the explanation is heroic kings, giants, or fallen angels, the function is similar, to make sense of the silent weight of the past. In that light, Nephilim traditions and megalith stories sit side by side. Both look at something that feels excessive, a terrifying warrior, a vast stone, a ruined wall, and reach for language that raises it above the ordinary. Mighty men of old, men of renown, those who make us feel small. Recognizing the human engineering behind megaliths does not require us to shrug and walk away unmoved. Awe does not evaporate just because we can describe ramps and levers. If anything, seeing how much coordination, patience, and sheer endurance went into these constructions can deepen that awe. We're no longer staring at the handiwork of vague giants. We are seeing the collective effort of thousands of named and unnamed people, each with their own lives and fears and hopes, pulling rope, shaping stone, carrying baskets of earth. The temptation of easy explanations, giants did it, angels did it, a lost civilization did it, is understandable. It offers a tidy answer in place of slow, complex histories. But when we sit with the complexity, when we let the human story behind the stones come into focus, the mystery does not vanish. It changes. The question becomes less, could humans have built this? And more, what kind of society chooses to pour this much labour into a monument? What were they saying to their gods, to their enemies, to their descendants, to themselves? Those are quieter questions. They do not resolve into a single dramatic image of a giant lifting a stone with one hand, but they bring us closer to the people who actually lived among these monuments, and they prepare us for a final step in our journey, asking what remains of the Nephilim story when we set aside the easy answers and listen, as carefully as we can, to both the stones and the texts that have outlasted their builders. When we press the Nephilim tradition very gently between our fingers, when we stop trying to squeeze out a single hard conclusion, some things crumble, others remain. The first thing that dissolves is the illusion of simplicity. Genesis 6 gives us only a few lines. Sons of God, daughters of men, Nephilim, mighty men of old, men of renown. No explanation, no backstory, no step-by-step account of how heaven and earth became entangled. Just a brief, dense knot of words at the threshold of the flood story. Later writers do not leave that knot alone. Numbers 13 takes the name Nephilim and folds it into a fear report. Deuteronomy stretches it across a catalogue of tall peoples, rephaim, Anakim, Emim, Zamzumim, so that giants become part of a geopolitical map. 1 Enoch unwinds the story into a full narrative about watchers, forbidden knowledge, monstrous offspring and cosmic judgment. Second Temple authors debate, adapt, resist, or embrace that expansion. Early Christians inherit not one tidy doctrine, but a stack of overlapping possibilities, and around all of this, the cultures of the region are telling their own, strangely familiar stories. Mesopotamian sages who are half divine, half human, teaching arts and sciences before a great flood. Ancient kings whose heights and reigns are exaggerated to superhuman scales. Ruined walls that demand explanation, and get it in the form of primordial builders, heroic ages, and peoples who are like gods. Instead of a single clear line, we get a tangle. Texts layered over texts. labels that shift from one group to another, heights that grow a little taller with each retelling, heroes who become monsters, local enemies who become living proof that the land is dangerous or destined, a small verse in Genesis that becomes a vast canvas for later imagination. That uncertainty is not a failure of the tradition. It is one of its essential features. These are not scientific reports. They are theological, political, and imaginative reflections written over centuries in changing circumstances by people with different needs and fears. Of course the categories blur. Of course the terms slide. Nephilim, rephaim, Anakim, mighty men, heroes, giants. Each word carries older echoes and picks up new ones as it moves through time. So what can we say without pretending to know more than we do? One plausible model is mythic memory. Human communities encounter real experiences of being overmatched, enemies who seem unnaturally strong, champions who dominate the field of battle, rulers whose power extends so far it feels almost inhuman. Over generations, these impressions harden into stories. A warrior becomes a giant. A dynasty becomes a race. An especially old or remote burial ground becomes the resting place of ancient superhuman dead. Another model is heroic age storytelling. Many cultures tell stories about a time before now, when people were bigger, braver, closer to the gods. The Nephilim, the mighty men of old, fit that pattern. They mark a period when human violence spiraled out of control, when strength was used not to protect but to dominate, and when divine patience finally snapped. The brief mention in Genesis 6 may be less interested in anatomy than in ethics. These are not just tall people. They're an intensification of humanity gone wrong. A third strand is the development of demonology. In early layers, the sons of God are not necessarily evil. They are simply members of the divine court stepping over a boundary. But as Jewish thought encounters exile, empire, and foreign religious systems, older divine figures can be reclassified. The Watchers of one Enoch begin as heavenly beings, but become a way to talk about the origin of spirits that harass, tempt, and deceive. Their gigantic children become bodies for evil to inhabit in story form. Later, Christian and Jewish demonologies will draw on this reservoir, turning the tangled pre-flood episode into a kind of prehistory of evil, and beneath all of that runs a strong political current. Calling your enemies sons of Enoch, tying their cities to the memory of rephaim, or placing them in the shadow of pre-flood corruption is not neutral. It marks them as part of a dangerous lineage, people whose claim to the land is old but doomed, impressive but under judgment. At the same time, tracing your own lineage back through these names can be a way of claiming that you stand in the long flow of human history, that your present struggle is part of something much bigger. However we arrange these models, mythic memory, heroic age narrative, demonology, political identity, they are all trying to do similar work. They use the image of beings larger than life to talk about boundaries between divine and human, between ordered creation and chaos, between our people and those people, between safety and threat, known and unknown. A giant at the edge of the land is a story version of a warning sign. Beyond this point, things change. Power is less predictable. Rules are less clear. Costs are higher. This helps explain why the tradition persists even when we no longer live in a world that thinks in terms of watchers and rephaim. We still feel the presence of forces that dwarf us, empires, economies, technologies, ecological changes. We still tell stories about eras when humans overreached and paid the price. We still worry that some knowledge might be too heavy to handle well. The language of giants, fallen angels, and mighty men gives these feelings shape. For some readers, the Nephilim remain literal hybrid beings. For others, they are symbols or reflections of foreign myths or traces of long-lost dynasties. The evidence we have does not compel a single choice. The texts themselves resist it. If we hold the tradition carefully, we do not have to force it into one box. We can allow that Genesis is deliberately brief, that it alludes to ideas its first audience would have recognized without spelling them out for us. We can recognize that Numbers, Deuteronomy, 1 Enoch, and later writings are interpreting, reworking, and sometimes arguing about that older kernel. We can see Mesopotamian Apkallu tales and giant king lists as part of the same conversational world without collapsing them into a single original story. And we can live with the unanswered questions. Were there unusually tall lineages in the ancient Levant? Almost certainly. Did they stand head and shoulders above their neighbours in a way that encouraged legend? Possibly. Did ancient writers fold those impressions into older stories about divine beings stepping out of their lane? The texts strongly suggest they did, but the exact proportions, how much is biological, how much is political rhetoric, how much is theological imagination, remain uncertain. They probably always will. Sitting with that uncertainty does not empty the Nephilim story of meaning. It changes how we relate to it. Instead of demanding that the text give us a clear photograph of the past, we can let it function as it did for its first hearers, as a warning about power without restraint, as a reminder that not every boundary crossing is harmless, and as an invitation to see our own age of mighty ones with a little more sobriety. In the quiet of that posture, a different kind of mystery comes into focus. Not the puzzle of how tall an ancient soldier was, but the larger question of how human beings, cross millennia, have tried to name the forces that frighten and fascinate them. That is the place we will end in, not with a solved riddle, but with a gentle reflection on what it means to be curious about these old stories, to respect their depth, and to ask how they might still speak, without demanding that they answer more than they were ever meant to say. So where does that leave us, standing here at the edge of this long, tangled tradition? We've walked through a lot of layers together. We started with the small, dense knot in Genesis 6, a few lines about sons of God, daughters of men, and Nephilim at the threshold of the flood. We listened to Numbers 13 turn that old name into fuel for fear, and to Deuteronomy weave rephaim, Anakim, and other tall peoples into a map of contested land and threatened borders. We watched 1 Enoch take the brief hint of mighty men of old and stretch it into a full story of watchers, forbidden knowledge, and cosmic judgment. We saw Second Temple writers argue with each other in the margins of that story, deciding what to keep, what to resist, and how to connect it to questions of evil, suffering, and hope. We glanced sideways at Mesopotamian Apkallu, at giant kings and heroic ages in royal inscriptions, at ruined walls and megaliths that begged for explanation. We held archaeological evidence up against legend and saw that it can tell us about average heights, nutrition, trauma, and disease, but not about hybrids of heaven and earth. We traced how memory, myth, genealogy, propaganda, and theology blur into one another until clear lines become hard to draw. Through all of it, the same boundary kept returning, the line between what we can know and what we can only infer. The fascination is real. It always has been. Ancient writers were no less curious than we are about strange bones, old graves, and whispers of a world before the flood. But the distance between their questions and our evidence is wide. Pretending that we can close that gap completely doesn't serve the text or the past very well. So we live with partial answers. We can say that these stories remember encounters with real power, military, political, spiritual, that felt larger than life. We can say that they use the language of giants and fallen beings to talk about violence, overreach, and dangerous knowledge. We can say that later communities kept rereading and retelling them because they still felt true to the shape of human fear. What we cannot say, with any honesty, is exactly where history ends and myth begins. Maybe that's the lingering question to carry with you as you drift into the rest of your night. When an ancient people points to a ruined city, or an old graveyard, or a name like Nephilim, and says, "Something extraordinary happened here," how much of that is fact that has slipped out of our reach? And how much is the deep human need to wrap the unknown in a story we can tell? Thank you for spending this quiet stretch of time here, thinking slowly with me. If this gentle dive into the Nephilim mystery has helped you relax or given you something to ponder, I'd be grateful if you'd tap like, leave a comment and subscribe so you don't miss future explorations. And I'd love to hear from you in particular. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there as this plays? However you answer, and whatever you believe about giants, fallen angels, and the ancient world behind Genesis, may your question stay soft, your curiosity stay awake, and your night be peaceful.